Happy Monday, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. And I don't know if you feel the same way that I do, but if you're with us last week, you know when I returned from vacation, the voice didn't sound very good. I don't know that it sounds typically very good on a normal day anyway, but I feel pretty confident that it sounds a lot better today than it did at the end of last week. So maybe that suggests a good week of shows coming up for us. We're going to have some fun today. Chip Towers will be here. We'll address some of the news that's been going on with UGA as of late. I've got a topic starter, conversation starter, almost certain to ignite a debate. We'll have some fun with that and kind of everything else in between as we catch up on all things UGA here on this Monday. We're glad you're with us. DawgNation Daily begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
All right, coming up in just a couple of minutes, I have got some thoughts to share, and I think this may start a bit of a debate, which is, I guess, probably, admittedly, part of the reason why we're doing this. And I don't remember what started this around here, but I came up with my ranking of what I believe are the toughest games for Georgia this upcoming season, and you can tell me how I get this wrong coming up in just a couple of minutes. Before we get to that, though, there was something that I saw on the internet last week, and I thought, boy, this is too interesting not to bring up at some point on DawgNation Daily. It involves the Georgia offense, how it compares to some of the other offenses around college football in a key particular stat. I think if you really want to boil this down, I think you can really see the specific area in which I'd like to see more from Georgia in 2019. And if Georgia can provide more in this one key specific area, not to oversimplify things, but I think this kind of speaks for itself, this one particular area, if Georgia can find just a little bit more of this one thing, it could lead to a national championship this season. I don't think that's too big of a stretch to say that. It does center around Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm. Fromm, who has had quite a career already at Georgia, stepping in as a surprise starter in the 2017 season after Jacob Eason's injury. He played admirably on the road at Notre Dame, became the anchor for this team as went to the college football playoff at the end of the 2017 season. And really, in 2018, he took his game from a statistical standpoint to an even additional level. He improved even more in his second season as starter in 2018. And now there is that need both for Fromm individually so he can one day make big-time money in the NFL, and Georgia collectively so he can have the kind of quarterback that can lead it to a national championship. Now in 2019, there's that need and that hope and desire for Fromm to now take another big step forward. And we've talked about this on DawgNation Daily a lot, even over the course of this offseason, even catching up with Trent Dilfer at one point in time, the head coach, so to speak, of the Elite 11 quarterback camp. And I asked Dilfer directly, what does Fromm need to do? How does he need to improve here this upcoming season to take that next step with his career? And when we talked about that back in, I guess, early February it was, Trent Dilfer had a very, very specific thing in mind for Jake Fromm. Here is what he said then.
I think he needs to be a little more athletic at the position. He needs to improve in the pocket. He needs to improve his movement patterns. He's got the arm, he's got the brain, he's got the toughness, he's got the leadership. He needs to step it up a little bit athletically, and at that age you can still improve athletically. So we'll see what this next year has for him, but for me, my emphasis if I was coaching him would be show a little more dynamic qualities as an athlete.
I think what Dilfer says there is really interesting, and I think that he certainly is an expert at the quarterback position. He knows what he's talking about. I think the problem, though, with what Dilfer says there, it can be a little bit difficult for us to know. So Dilfer says, I'm looking to see this movement pattern in the backfield when you get the ball in your hand, and that's something that a guy like Dilfer is going to pick up and recognize right away. For many of us, though, when we look in on Jake Fromm, we're not necessarily going to see exactly what Dilfer sees when he looks in on that or what other quarterback experts might see when they look in on Fromm. For us, we almost need to distill it down to something a little bit more simple to really get an idea of just how much Jake Fromm is improving as a third-year quarterback in 2019. That's where a different piece of analysis becomes helpful, I believe, and a different piece of analysis becomes something that's particularly interesting to think about. There's a guy named David Hale, who's a longtime college football writer. I'm not sure who he's working for now, but he's been covering college football for quite some time. And he tweeted out the other day, and I saw this on Twitter, he tweeted out teams in college football that were the most impressive in 2018 in terms of passes of 20 or more yards down the field. Now, Georgia's not on the list of the top of these teams, but I do want to show you the list from David Hale, the college football writer, as far as who does it the most. Oklahoma State, you're probably not surprised. Big 12 offense, 3.23 throws of 20 or more yards down the field per game in 2018. Once again, West Virginia, another Big 12-style offense, NFL-capable quarterback. West Virginia was at 2.83 throws of 20 or more yards per 20 or more yards down the field per game. Then you get to Oklahoma, no surprise there. Then you see Alabama right in the middle of that list, if you're watching on video, at 2.67 throws of 20 or more yards down the field per game. Keep Alabama in mind here, because Alabama is the SEC team that's on this list. It's a lot of Big 12 type teams or a Pac-12 team in Stanford, and then just below that at 2.67 throws of 20 or more yards down the field is the Alabama Crimson Tide. Well, a Georgia fan came back on Twitter to David Hale and say, hey, it was really interesting to see that list of all those teams that had the most 20 or more yards throws per game last season. But where does Georgia rank on this list? Where would Florida rank on this list with its quarterback Felipe Franks? And David Hale obliged on Twitter and gave the answer for that. That Fromm last season was 14 of 44 for 575 yards with 6 touchdowns and a pick and 182 passer rating on those throws of 20 or more yards down the field. By comparison, Felipe Franks was 20 of 55 for 661 yards, also 6 touchdowns, a pick, and a 169.7 passer rating. But the interesting number, the only thing from that on Jake Fromm I want you to think about is the number 14. Georgia had 14 passes of 20 or more yards down the field in 2018, which puts you at about 1 per game. Alabama was at about 2.67. Let's, for the simplicity of math, round that up to 3, and for the simplicity of math, say Georgia was at 1. Alabama had 3 throws of 20 or more yards per game last season, thereabouts. Georgia had about 1. So if you really want to get to what I believe could be the essence of the improvement that the Georgia offense needs to show this upcoming season, it's a very simple question. Can Georgia, and Jake Fromm in particular, he is the quarterback on this year's team. After all, this team belongs to him now, undisputedly. Can Georgia find 2 more big throws per game? Big throws being defined as throws of 20 or more yards down the field. Can Georgia find 2 more of those per game? If they can find 2 more of those per game this season, to get somewhere near where Alabama was at about, just under 3 per game last year. If Georgia can take that step towards Alabama this season, I think that could dynamically change the Georgia offense. And the good news is, when you listen to Jake Fromm talk about these kinds of things, Fromm himself seems really ready to do this. Fromm, even going into the Alabama game last December against a really good Crimson Tide defense, was ready to go for home run throws in that game. Because if you listen to Fromm tell it, not only is he confident in his ability to throw it, but the guys that he has lining up as wide receivers, he's confident in their ability to step up and catch those balls as well. So if you're looking to see Georgia take that next step, the eagerness of Jake Fromm to do just that, I think, gives you some hope. Here's what Fromm said about that back in December.
I feel very comfortable with our guys anytime they're manned up on anybody. From all the work we do throughout the summer, throughout fall camp, throughout the season, our guys are making plays right now. They're doing an awesome job, creating separation versus man coverage, whether it's zone, whether it's man. Our guys are doing a great job.
Now, what's interesting about what Fromm said then is he's talking about some guys that he won't have in 2019. He's talking partially about McCole Hardman there. He's talking partially about Riley Ridley there. But those guys are on their way to the NFL. But what's maybe better news, though, for Georgia is that the crop of wide receivers that Fromm's expecting to throw to this season may actually be more well-equipped for those kinds of big throws, those 20 or more yard throws. You may have the perfect complement of wide receivers this season to do that. At least that's what you hope these guys grow into. I'm talking about a guy like Demetrius Robertson, who was on the Georgia roster last year and for whatever reason just not ready to blossom in that role. This was a guy who was, let's not forget, a freshman All-American going back to his time at Cal in 2016. Maybe the year spent learning was one that Robertson's going to benefit from this season. Maybe Robertson, who uses that dynamic speed, he may be among the fastest players in the Georgia roster. Maybe he uses that to create the kind of separation that can lead to some of these big-time throws. Maybe it's a guy like a freshman, Dominic Blaylock, who, if you look at his high school film in the Atlanta area, this is a guy that became a big-time fan favorite with a lot of Georgia fans because of how exciting he was as a high school player. I think Blaylock has a chance to contribute to some of this. And admittedly, because it's been a fixation of mine for quite some time, I do think, assuming all works out well in the classroom, and I have no reason to believe that it won't, I do believe that George Pickens plays a big role in all of this too. And I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want to overhype what Pickens might be able to do in his first year. That would be unfair for me to put that kind of level of expectation on him and set up a scenario where Pickens is, being thought by fans to need to do too much in his first year in the Georgia roster. But Benjamin Wolk, who's covered this guy from the Auburn side of things for a while, the Auburn recruiting reporter who joined us a couple of weeks ago, said that he's the best high school player that he's seen in his years of covering this industry and covering that kind of stuff. That's the kind of dynamic athlete that he is. And if you're looking to see Georgia find some of those big-time throws that the Jerry Judys of the world were hauling in, Jalen Waddle, who made a big impact in that role as a freshman for Alabama in 2018, if you're looking to see some of that from Georgia in 2019, then honesty does compel me to admit that I think that George Pickens may be the most likely, the best example of who might be able to do that for Georgia this season. And not only is this a case where Pickens can give Georgia what it needs, but if you listen to George Pickens talk, maybe this is a Georgia offense that can also give him what he wants, which are some individual accolades. He'd like to be an award winner. He'd like to become a one-day future NFL star. And he thinks the Georgia offense is absolutely the offense that can be a springboard to him for all of that. And if you're a Georgia fan, that's certainly good news too. Here's George Pickens.
Georgia was a great school for me to go to, I feel, in my personal opinion, because they have everything that you kind of want. I mean, who doesn't want to win a ring? Who doesn't want to be up for freshman All-American? Who doesn't want to win a Biletnikoff? Who doesn't want to play with great players? So that's why I feel like Georgia's always good for me.
Who doesn't want to play with great players? Who doesn't want to win the Biletnikoff? Who doesn't want to be a freshman All-American? Who doesn't want to win the ring? I do believe that ring that Georgia's been looking for, I think the missing piece in all of that equation may be some more of the big-time throws that guys like George Pickens hope to haul in their college career. I think that Jake Fromm is the quarterback to throw them. I think that Pickens and others are the receivers to catch them. And that offense taking that step forward in 2019 could be the thing that leads Georgia to that land that it's been wanting to go to, that land of championships. It could indeed be a lot of fun. My name is Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hello to you, and thanks for being with us. Hopefully you're like me and feel like the voice is sounding a little better today compared to where it was at the end of last week. So hopefully we're on to a better start to this week, at least as far as all that goes. Nonetheless, we're glad to have you with us live on video, 10 a.m., DawgNation Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and in podcast form, pretty much wherever you find podcasts, the Apple Podcast Player, the Google Podcast Player, the world-famous DawgNation.com. We're just really glad you found us today. We've got Chip Towers coming up in just a moment. Before that, though, I want to go around the doghouse here today, presented by our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And I don't remember what got us off on this conversation, but on our video comments for the last couple of days, last couple of weeks maybe even, we've been having a little bit of debate that kind of led me to want to lay it out on kind of black and white stark terms about what I believe are Georgia's toughest games for this upcoming season. And I've got my opinions based on very specific criteria, and I honestly want to hear from you in terms of how you feel about it. You can either reach out to me on Twitter, @DawgNation Daily, or you can hit me up on the comment section here live on video, whether it be the Facebook page, the YouTube feed, the Twitter feed. I'd love to have you react to this as well as we go around the doghouse with some thoughts today on exactly what Georgia might be facing in 2019. And I guess when I look ahead and personally think about this 2019 schedule, I guess there is one thing that hangs in my mind over all of this discussion based on what we've seen from Georgia in 2018, what we've seen from Georgia in 2017. Over the last couple of seasons, the one criticism that Georgia to this point has not yet been able to erase is how it performs in hostile road environments. In hostile road environments, we've seen Georgia now 2 years in a row be less than its best. So when I think about demons to exercise in this upcoming season, we just talked a lot about, hey, what's it going to take to get Georgia into that true national championship conversation? Well, you can lay out some specific on-field stuff, but some kind of intangible off-the-field stuff that Georgia's going to think about and wrestle with. It's how do you handle that hostile road environment? So when you see my top 5 games, I think you're going to see those hostile road environments play a big role in all of this. In fact, if you're watching on video, let me show you the full screen. If you're listening, I'll obviously say this to you, whether it's radio or podcast. Here is my ranking of top 5 toughest games this season. Number 1 on my list, I have the road trip to Auburn on November 16th. This is, for me, a reminder of what happened the last time George was here back in 2017. Hostile crowd, fast start from Auburn. Georgia had a hard time reacting to that. You want to see better from Georgia in that here in 2019. And many of you are going to say, well, BA, Auburn's not going to be quite that good. They're not going to be a top 10 team this year. On paper, that's certainly probably the case. This is probably still a top 25 team, though. And a top 25 team playing behind a hostile crowd could be dangerous for Georgia that day. Dangerous enough that I have it ranked number 1 on my list of Georgia's most toughest games here for 2019. Below that, I have Texas A&M at number 2. I do believe that Texas A&M, by the time they come to Athens on November 23rd, has a chance to be a very highly ranked team. And I think that's the kind of game for Georgia that's going to feel like as big a home atmosphere for an SEC game as Georgia's felt in quite some time. I think this could be a pretty big deal for Georgia. I've got that at number 2. Surprisingly, for maybe some of you, at number 3, I have at Tennessee on October 5th. I don't believe that Tennessee is among the toughest opponents that Georgia faces this season. I don't think it's going to have one of the better records. I don't even believe that Tennessee is going to be a top 25 team. But once again, though, this is another example of being in a hostile road environment. I think Neyland Stadium will be that on October 5th when Georgia has to go there. It's the kind of thing that I think that Georgia gets a chance to prove itself. Now, obviously, in 2017, being at Neyland was no big deal. Georgia won 41-0. I think the Tennessee roster under Jeremy Pruitt has improved somewhat since then, and my expectation is it'll at least be enough of a road test that we'll find out a pretty good bit about Georgia that day. Then to round out my top 5 pretty quickly, I've got Florida at 4. That's obviously a game that takes place in Jacksonville on November 2nd. And here's my feeling on the Gators. I think that every year you see preseason top 10 teams, one of those teams by the end of the year finishes unranked. I think there's a chance that Florida's in the conversation to be that team in 2019. I have heard a lot of hype for the Gators over the course of this offseason. And to me, it all rings in my ears as too much too soon. Now, many of you will say, well, BA, you're just the chief Gator hater. That's just a red and black colored glasses. Be that as it may, we'll find out ourselves this upcoming season. But I feel like the conversation about Florida is getting well out in front of the actual likelihood of expectations here this season. So for me, Florida is no more than the 4th toughest game that Georgia will face this season. And then for me, number 5, I've got Notre Dame on September 21st. Based on record of opponent, or I should say ranking of opponent, Notre Dame will probably be the highest ranked team that Georgia plays all season because Notre Dame is going to probably have a very high preseason ranking. But Notre Dame cannot keep pace with Georgia in Sanford Stadium. It just can't. I think that being distracted by the playoff hurt Georgia in the Sugar Bowl last year, but that's the kind of thing that's likely to, I think, work in Georgia's favor in September. I think Georgia will be plenty motivated to show the committee that it got it wrong in 2018. And I think the Fighting Irish could be on the receiving end of a big-time whipping that day in Athens. So that's my top 5. I'd love to have you weigh in with yours or where I'm wrong in terms of the toughest games that Georgia faces this season, and we'll certainly have some fun with that in the comment section a little bit later on. By the way, it's Around the Doghouse presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. They can help equip your house with energy-efficient windows and doors. They're a national company, but they also have a local branch right here in Georgia, which means you get the local service, but also the power and the prestige of a national company. You get it both with Pella Window and Door. And right now you can also get a great offer. 50% off, I should say 40% off qualifying installations or 0% APR for 48 months. That's valid through March 28th. So you got to go right now to take advantage of 40% off on those qualifying installations or the 0% APR. Simply schedule your in-home consultation one of 2 ways. Find them online at pellasoutheast.us. That website, once again, pellasoutheast.us. Or give them a call in their Dunwoody showroom at 404-445-2979. That's 404-445-2979. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is viewed to be the best. It's great to have you on DawgNation Daily here today. Hope you will stick with us later on. The legendary former coach of the Georgia Bulldogs, Vince Dooley, has spoken out in a pretty interesting way on what was a hot topic for Georgia last week. We'll get to that coming up in a moment. For now, though, let's talk to our buddy Chip Towers.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
It's great to have Chip Towers here on DawgNation Daily, especially when there's been so much going on around the Georgia program over the last few days. And, of course, Chip's a great voice to catch up with on a lot of that kind of stuff. So, Chip, we appreciate you spending some time with us here this morning. Hope you're doing well. Hope you had a great weekend. It's really beautiful weather around the state of Georgia yesterday. Hope you get a chance to enjoy that, and thanks for being with us here today.
It's great to have you back, BA, and it's great to see a little sunshine these past couple of days. I hope it lasts and carries on. But the forecast is not real encouraging last time I looked at it.
Well, yeah, certainly around here things have a way of changing pretty fast. Let's talk about what was a big story last week. The change to the Auburn schedule, based on what you wrote at DawgNation.com, it sounds like your opinion is very closely in line with mine. It seems hard to understand what Georgia is getting out of this or what it thinks it's getting out of this. Now, for some fans, it's not a big deal to them whether the game's played in November or October, but there is a natural curiosity on my part to find out what was behind this from the Georgia side. Chip, I've obviously gone round and round about the fact that I think it's a bad deal for Georgia, but I am genuinely curious to figure out what Georgia was hoping to gain by doing this. What is Georgia's side of the story on really acquiescing and giving Auburn exactly what it wanted?
Well, at this point, all we can do is believe as the truth, what we're being told by Greg McGarity and Jerry Moorhead, who are very adamant about saying, in the immediate aftermath of this, that this is what Kirby wanted, and that he was either accepting or liked this. Now, we have not had an opportunity to really fully vet that with Kirby Smart, and I'm eager to get a chance to do that. We haven't had an opportunity really to talk to Kirby, in a question and answer format since the Sugar Bowl. But they say in no uncertain terms that he was for this. Anytime, and I do buy this part of it, the general process of what's going on is the 2020 schedule is getting to be released. This is the regular reset time for the 2020 schedule. Obviously, Auburn has been outspoken about their need or want or desire to move off of that date so that they're not playing Georgia and Alabama, back-to-back, not really back-to-back, but in back-to-back conference contests on the road. So it's, there's no question that is Auburn's move, Auburn's impetus to have this game moved. Now, you can't do anything. You can't move any of these sliding tiles without the agreement of both the conference and the other school. And this was vetted through the SEC with Georgia. Georgia, in turn, Greg McGarity vets it with Kirby Smart. And they say, this is what it will look like. Are you okay with this? And we're told, thumbs up from Kirby Smart. I'm good with that. Now, you and I both, Brandon, I think, I just assume things never change, right? I mean, I've always liked this. And I think one of the dangers of the whole thing, this Georgia-Auburn series has really gone well for Georgia in the past several years. So even though Georgia, had to do that back-to-back thing in 12 and 13, Georgia is owning the Auburn rivalry of late, and certainly under Kirby Smart. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? So I think it would have been fine staying like it is. Plus, I like to me it's always been Florida, Auburn, Georgia Tech, Florida, Auburn, Georgia Tech. How Georgia ends against their three biggest rivals determines what kind of year they're going to have. That's not going to be the case. Now, I can see where Tennessee, which is how this is supposed to change, fits well into that spot, particularly, and I don't think this is talked about enough, Brandon, from the standpoint of you've got a stamp the East game, right before, so whoever's going to represent the East, Georgia and Tennessee, are going to have something to be said about that late in the season. I get that, and that makes sense to me. But generally, I think it was fine just like it was, but it looks like we're going to see a change in 2020.
Let me just do one quick follow-up on this because I think it's important to remind. It seems like it's been weirdly confusing for some people that while Tennessee may fit well at the end of the season as you said, kind of a referendum on the SEC East, the one way in which it doesn't seem to be a good fit based on Kirby Smart's previous statements on this, he didn't like those back-to-back road games near the end of the season playing at Georgia Tech, at Auburn in the same year. Tennessee's no alleviation for that because as it currently stands, they're on the same home and away model where Georgia plays at Tennessee in the same years that it plays at Auburn. So based on Kirby Smart's previous statements on this isn't the comfort that he was seeking.
Yeah, no, and ultimately we don't know that. I mean, based on the the logic and everything you look at, you think that would continue the way it is, the rotation right now. Then Tennessee would still be on, represent an away game back to back there at the end with Georgia Tech. We don't know that 100%. We'll see. I'm told with a kind of wink, wink, from McGarity and those that, hey, just wait till the schedule comes out and you'll understand how this is okay. So ultimately, we got to see how it shakes out for everybody before we can be certain of it. You're right. I mean, if that ends up being the change, you're just you're just robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's really the same thing. It's just an Eastern game versus a Western game. And here's another thing. It's cold in Knoxville in late November. I mean, that's going to be a very cold game up there on the banks of the Tennessee River. Generally, Georgia has played that in September or early October at the latest, and it's always been, the weather's basically been a non-factor. That could be a little bit of a factor going forward.
Let me talk about Greg McGarity for a moment. The athletic director, in the midst of all this, signs a one-year extension. The one-year part of this, to me, seems a little bit weird. It would seem, one way or another, you'd either sign a longer extension or you'd announce some sort of change of plans, either him deciding to retire, Georgia deciding to move on. The one-year extension seems a little weird. Chip, for the most part, I'm agnostic on McGarity. I'm not nearly as anti-McGarity as some of our audience is, nor am I probably as pro-McGarity, maybe as some other factions of the donor base may be. I just kind of somewhere in the middle in all of that. There are times when I wish he was a little more fiery, the way that I think Alan Green was in this issue with the Auburn schedule change, or maybe an LSU athletic director like Joe Oliva, what he's been over the last couple of years. Those are guys who've really given full voice to speaking up for their program, and I think they've benefited from that. McGarity chooses to do things a little differently. I don't always love that, but for the most part, I don't really have a strong feeling one way or another about Greg McGarity. What do you think of McGarity getting the one-year deal, and what do you think of the way that Georgia fans view him and the way that he ought to be viewed?
Well, first off, I'll say, again, we're left to trust what those in leadership are telling us. And, again, McGarity and Moorhead were both pretty emphatic that this was, quote unquote, McGarity's idea, the 1-year extension. Now, it's been described in other places, and I get it, as lukewarm and tepid. But, there's two things on McGarity that make me believe it. One, when he first came in, which is now about 10 years ago, I had a one-on-one interview with him, not too much after. It was in his first year. I can't remember when it was. And he intimated to me at that time that he said he couldn't see himself doing this more than 10 years. And if you know McGarity on a personal level, you kind of get that. I mean, he's a guy that he's not real big on ego. He doesn't really need this job to validate how he feels about himself. That's actually counterintuitive to a lot of people that lead these positions. Usually they're very ambitious and egotistical. He's really not that way. And, you can understand, I think Brandon, I can anyway, that, he's 64 years old, 42 years in higher education, fully vested, from a standpoint of benefits and all that kind of stuff. And, he can walk away and just go travel the world with his wife, Cheryl, anytime he wants to. So there's that. Then there's the other thing, the ongoing project, that Georgia has. Right now, I think, look, Kirby Smart was his hire. Georgia has been knocking on the door for a national championship. I think, Greg McGarity would like to be a part of that. 2019 is a huge year for Georgia. All of us who follow them closely know that and realize why that's the case. And I think, Greg McGarity does too, and he would love to, see Georgia cross the finish line in that regard. This is a guy that's a Georgia alum. The other part of that is basketball. He made the rather notable move of firing Mark Fox that a lot of, coaches in the business anyway thought that was a little bit ruthless, and then replacing him with Tom Crean. He has pledged that Tom Crean is full support on getting basketball turned around, much in the way he was involved with getting basketball turned around at the University of Florida. So, I think, if Georgia were to win a national championship in football this year and maybe have a pretty good year in basketball next year, you might say Greg McGarity says, all right, that, things are going pretty good. I can pass the baton to the next guy. I believe that general. I believe that's the truth. The other side of it is Greg McGarry's not a very exciting guy. He's big on protocol. He's not going to get out there and talk on his own kind of the way Alan Green did about this is what we're wanting. He won't tell you what Georgia really wants when it comes to their scheduling needs for the future and those kind of things. He plays all those things like you're supposed to behind closed doors, or if there's a facility thing about to come online like we're about to have with the football facility, he's not going to discuss it in detail until it's been fully vetted by the Board of Regents, which is what the protocol is. So he's a stickler for those kind of details. It's not very sexy, but it helps with higher up, with the SEC office, with the NCAA, and certainly with Georgia's board and their president.
Let me do a couple quick things before we let you go. First of all, since you and I last spoke on this show, Georgia has got a defensive coordinator, I guess, Dan Lanning in that role, co-defensive coordinator for Glenn Schumann. I think it's confusing how Georgia rolled this out. It's also somewhat inexplicable to me why they wouldn't want to put more of a spotlight on what I think is a good young and up-and-coming coach like Lanning. You know, I'm not so much into the media part of this of, hey, why not hold a press conference? But I guess, Chip, I do find myself wondering, why not at least announce it as opposed to having it to be, you know, almost like it was something you were trying to keep secret, you know, open records request to find out who the defensive coordinator was. It seems to me that Lanning is owed more than this from Georgia, and I think it would help him on the recruiting trail to be touted a bit more. Why do you think Georgia's choosing to go about this in such an unorthodox way?
Yeah, I don't have a strong theory on that, and I share your questions about it, Brandon, because I do think it's a little bit odd. I mean, look, you know, a coordinator on any staff is a notable position, and you know, times have changed a little bit. I get the entire hire, and if you go back in DawgNation, I wrote a story on Dan Lanning, you know, called From Elizabeth Street to Stanford Drive. This is a fascinating backstory of how Dan Lanning got into this position, and just talk about a guy who is cashed his check on himself, you know, self-belief and pragmatism and focus and hustle. It's a terrific story. Not forgetting that Glenn Schumann is part of this equation, but I think it's pretty clear that Dan Lanning is coordinator and Glenn Schumann is co-coordinator. And I also get the side, you know, and Kirby talked about this, I think, when he spoke with recruits down in Macon, that, you know, I mean, Kirby has a way he wants things run, and he's not going to go out and hire some big-name defensive coordinator from another program and say, okay, come in here and bring your system and run the defense for me. We've all watched Kirby close enough. That's not how he works, you know. When they huddle up on the sideline in big moments in defense, it's going to be Kirby Smart in the middle of it, and that's even with, you know, a grizzled veteran like he had, a well-respected Mel Tucker. That was still the case. Kirby's the man when it comes to defense. He just needs somebody to run his defense. But as to why, you know, he's handled it like he has, it's a mystery to me. I don't know, and I'm looking forward. We'll get a chance to talk to him sooner or later, and when we do, you know, that's probably going to be a long press conference. There are a lot of questions, because there's a lot of questions that we need Kirby to answer eventually, and I'm sure he knows that and will in due time.
Let me do one quick thing before I let you go. Off the top of the program, I talked about a specific thing I'd like to see more from with the Georgia offense here this season, and those are those throws of 20 or more yards down the field. I won't get into all the stuff with you here, but I basically distilled it down to, if Georgia can find 2 more of those per game this season, I think that can make a big, big difference in the pursuit of a national championship here. I don't expect a huge overall from the Georgia offense, nor do I want there to be one, Chip. I still want this to be a football team that runs the ball. I want to use those big offensive linemen. But a couple extra deep throws per game, how reasonable is that to expect, you think?
I think that's very reasonable. In fact, I think that should be the expectation. I think it's what's going to happen. You know, between the changes, you know, certainly in James Coley coming, I think or taking over the offense, and just the general setup. I'm starting a series right now, which will start running today and all the way into the beginning of spring practice, you know, the pre-spring analysis. When you get in there and really get down in the weeds and start breaking down Georgia's roster, I mean, I think it's right for that kind of thing. I mean, Georgia's always going to bank on running the football first, and that is not going to be different in 2019. But one of the great things about being able to do that effectively is, you know, as a defense, you really better be, you know, prioritizing stopping that run. Otherwise, Georgia's going to gash you to death. and I think defense has done that to a large part. But between Jake Fromm being kind of unquestioned as the man, the makeup of Georgia's wide receiver core, which certainly Riley Ridley and McCole Hardman, losing them, that hurts you. But I don't know if this group is not going to improve overall, whether it be, Dominique Blaylock, whether it be the new kid that signed in the late period, and then the guys they have coming back. I mean, I think there's some speed and a particular skill set to be able to get down the field. And I just think between Coley's attitude, the personnel, and Jake Fromm being a junior who's out there practicing these throws every day, I think we're going to see not just a little bit more. I think we may see a lot more of that in 2019.
Yeah, that should be really interesting, Chip. Thanks for your time. We'll look forward to reading those pre-spring previews there at DawgNation.com. Never too early to start thinking about that. G-Day's actually not that far away, so that's a lot of fun to read and get ready for. And, Chip, we appreciate you writing it. We'll look forward to speaking to you back here on DawgNation Daily again very soon, too.
Looking forward to it, BA. Have a great week, buddy.
You too.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, really interesting from Chip Towers there. A very optimistic assessment of the Georgia offense. I want to talk more about that in a moment because I think that there are a couple of misunderstandings maybe even about just how close Georgia might being able to be to having a big breakthrough with its passing offense. We'll talk about that in a moment. Before that, let me remind you about our friends at Kroger. They got a great offer going on right now. You can order all your favorite items from Kroger Ship and have them delivered to your door. Free shipping plus 15% off your first order when you use the code SHIP15. That's SHIP15. Use that code and you can get 15% off your first order. Simply go to ship.kroger.com to start shopping. That's ship, SHIP.kroger.com to start shopping, and make sure you use the promo code SHIP15 to get the 15% off. So a couple things. First of all, my whole belief about Georgia and the 2 additional passes of 20 or more yards down the field, that's almost all based on the comparison to Alabama, which was, according to David Hale, the college football writer, at 2.67 throws last season of 20 or more yards per game down the field. Georgia only about 1 of those per game last season. Georgia can find 2 of those per game, and I think the misunderstanding is that somehow Alabama just threw it a lot more than Georgia did and ran it a lot less than Georgia did, that it became this offense under Mike Locksley last season with Tua Tagovailoa quarterback that was wildly different from what Nick Saban's offense had been in the past. The truth is, if you look a little deeper at the statistics, it really kind of wasn't. It didn't really subtract anything to get those passing plays. It just simply added to its offense. I mean, if you go to CFBstats.com, Alabama, in terms of total rushing attempts, it actually ran the ball last year for total number of attempts more than Georgia did. Now, it also played in 1 additional game, so that's a factor in some of that. But total number of rushing attempts, it ran the ball a total number of times more than Georgia did. In terms of total passing attempts, the numbers were Alabama at 438, Georgia at 356. What is that, a difference of about, 80 or so? About 4 passes per game? Passing attempts, I mean. Georgia might not have to throw the ball a ton more to find a couple more deep throws. Maybe just about 4 more attempts per game to get those 2 additional deep receptions, and the Georgia offense could take a big step forward what the Alabama offense did last season with Tua Tagovailoa quarterback. That could be a fun thing to pay attention to. I was looking at the comment section during my interview with Chip as well. There's a lot of reaction coming into my ranking of the toughest opponents for Georgia this season. We'll look forward to doing some of that on video later on as part of our R.S. Andrews cooldown as we kind of get your thoughts on everything happening around UGA as a part of that. Before that, though, let's do our SEC through and get some SEC stories in. I saw where Florida lost a couple of commits over the last couple of days. Neither one of these guys are guys that I'm all that big on. Kevon Lee, I guess, maybe the bigger overall name here, a 4-star athlete for the class of 2020. They also lost another guy the other day, too. I think what this goes to show you is that there's been a lot of grief about Georgia maybe being off to a quote-unquote slow start to its 2020 class, especially in comparison to LSU, which seems to have, 10, 11 commitments already, a lot of 4-stars, a 5-star. But with Florida losing guys, Georgia's still sending out a bunch of offers. We are still in kind of a stage where the 2020 class is just now coming together, and I think there was a time, if you want to go back to the 2018 recruiting cycle for sure, where we spent most of the spring and summer on this show. I'm not very proud to say this, but we spent most of the spring and summer pretty panicked about the state of Georgia's recruiting class. The time it had dropped down to like 60-something, or I think it even got down to the 70s at one point in time in terms of its ranking on the 24/7 Sports Composite. A lot has happened between then and now to lead us to believe that Georgia has no slow start to be worried about whatsoever, and maybe a couple losses to the Florida class, maybe another example of that. Auburn did pick up a commitment. It's the 4-star wide receiver J.J. Evans. This is not a major national-level prospect. It is a 4-star wide receiver, though, as Auburn tries to rebrand its offense there as well. Remember, Tigers still trying to figure out who their quarterback of the future is going to be. A lot of hope and belief about Bo Nix coming in as a freshman. We'll see on the recruiting trail in the months ahead for the class of 2020 or maybe the class of 2021 how much recruits are buying into the future of Auburn with Bo Nix, maybe even Gus Malzahn calling the plays, depending on how many big-time wide receivers choose to sign up for that program. Evans, with all due respect, is probably a big step down from where Auburn hoped to be with George Pickens, but nonetheless, we'll follow that and see where it goes. I saw where LSU is going to be without defensive tackle Rashard Lawrence for spring practice. He's going to have a surgery. That's going to keep him out. They've dealt with some of this kind of stuff in the past. A lot of their star players have missed spring practice over the last couple of years, and in some cases around college football, this ends up being a big deal. In some cases, not. When it comes to Lawrence, I gather that's probably not going to be that big of a deal. And I guess the overall takeaway from me is even with, guys like Devin White moving on to the NFL and guys like Greedy Williams moving on to the NFL, I'm still expecting this LSU defense to be pretty good. I think that Grant Delpit could be among the best players in the league. I think that Lawrence is a pretty top-flight player in his own right. Keeping Braden Fajoko in the fold there, the former Texas Tech transfer, this could still be a pretty good LSU defense this season, and another one of those teams, along with Texas A&M, that I think could be a little bit of a threat to Alabama in the SEC West here in 2019. And then one final point to get to and make here. I'm not the world's biggest NFL draft observer. I've told y'all that before. I not only do I not love the NFL draft, because of the way that a lot of the analysts talk about the draft, is about my least favorite event in all of sports. But I was looking at some of these mock drafts, and I was noticing that I guess you've got, the potential for 3 SEC offensive tackles maybe taking the first round. Jawan Taylor's as a tackle, right? Greg Little, the Ole Miss guy, and probably Jonah Williams, at least 3 of those guys taking the first round. And I think you can start to look ahead and fast forward a bit to the 2020 draft as well, where that could really be Andrew Thomas in that conversation. And think about how that changes the calculus for Georgia moving forward. The same way that linebackers will now follow in Roquan Smith's footsteps, and I think in the future you're going to see guys that want to follow in DeAndre Baker's footsteps, the winner of the Thorpe Award this past season. When it's Andrew Thomas next season, and that same conversation of the Greg Little and Jawan Taylor. I guess Taylor's a little bit banged up and hurt, but nonetheless, I think he's still going to be a first-round guy. Jonah Williams is going to be in that kind of discussion as well. When it's Andrew Thomas getting that kind of talk, when it's Andrew Thomas getting that kind of attention next season, think about how Sam Pittman's already dominated the offensive line recruiting wars of the last couple of years. How much easier does that job get once he can point to a real success story and say, I took Andrew Thomas, who, by the way, was not a 5-star coming out of high school, was a 4-star. But if he's on a top 10 pick next season, I think there's a very good chance that he will be. That could be a lot of fun for Georgia's future recruiting efforts, and for a guy like Thomas, a accolade that he would most definitely be deserving of. Just kind of a fun look ahead of the future, what that might be like. Maybe a little foreshadowing to more NFL draft success for a big Georgia offensive tackle in the 2020 draft. You hate to see him leave as a junior, but if he goes, that would be certainly a pretty good boon to the offensive line recruitment for the University of Georgia. We'll make that your SEC through. All right. Here on DawgNation Daily, I want to spend a moment kind of looking back at something I was talking to Chip Towers about before. And I know there's been this debate among some Georgia fans of why are other Georgia fans as bothered by the Auburn schedule change as we have been. I have been very outspoken about that. A lot of Georgia fans have agreed with me, but not everyone has. A lot of people have responded to me on Twitter, either at DawgNation Daily or in our comment section here, to say, hey, listen, BA, if Kirby Smart's fine with this, I'm fine with it. Well, what's the big deal? And I think the words of the legendary former Georgia coach Vince Dooley are a reminder of why this kind of is a little bit of a big deal. He was on a sports radio station in Mobile, Alabama, WNSP. He was on the program with the host there, and he was asked about this, and Dooley was pretty outspoken about his feelings on this and kind of where he thought Georgia went wrong on this. Let me show you the quote on the screen. And if you're listening, I'll obviously read it to you. This is Vince Dooley from WNSP in Mobile, Alabama. He says the change benefits Auburn. You can imagine some of the Georgia people are not happy with it because you get into a routine of when the game is scheduled, no question. It's very good for Auburn, and Georgia has evidently gone along with it. And it's that last line from Dooley that's kind of the problem here of, hey, this is what Auburn wanted, and Georgia's just kind of going along with it. That calls leadership into question. And listen, Dooley, in the frame of the same interview, did talk about how, as athletic director, he worked to change the long-standing tradition of playing Florida, Auburn, Georgia Tech in 3 consecutive games to end the season. So Dooley's no stranger to getting schedule changes done, but you don't like the idea of Auburn pushing for something, Georgia going along with it. Your hope is there'd be more leadership than that. And maybe when Kirby Smart speaks on this issue publicly, he'll be able to give some voice as to what he believes that Georgia's getting out of this. Because based on his previous statements about not wanting those 2 late November road games, this change doesn't seem to alleviate that at all. And I do think it leaves a lot of Georgia fans wondering, well, what did Georgia get out of all of this after all is said and done? All right, speaking of all being said and done, we're almost done here today on our program. Before we wrap up, I do want to remind you about a really good event coming up this Thursday with a great former Georgia Bulldog. That's Malcolm Mitchell. He's hosting a magical evening of literacy. It's this Thursday, February 28th, from 7 to 10 p.m. at the Foundry at Puritan Mill in Atlanta. You can join Malcolm Mitchell and learn more about his mission to inspire kids to read. The evening will begin with cocktails and a silent auction at 7 p.m. and, of course, dinner at 8 p.m. in addition to the fun of the live auction. Malcolm Mitchell's also going to talk about leadership and literacy. It's going to be a terrific evening, a diverse group of individuals who all share a philosophy and commitment to inspiring kids to read by placing books in their hands. Speaking of inspiring, there is nothing more inspiring than the way that Malcolm Mitchell has really become a great voice for literacy. And I tell you, I know a lot of young kids. I have young kids. The first book that he wrote was very well received and just a really cool, I think, role model that Mitchell is. Great career in football, and now stepping over and becoming a terrific author. That's a great thing to see as these former Georgia Bulldogs going to do big things in life. We're always happy when that happens here around DawgNation Daily. All right, something else that makes us very happy around here is the Gator Hater Updater, and I'm proud to say we are now at 849 days. That's how long it's been since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs. That is good news. We do the Gator Hater Updater every single day here on DawgNation Daily. I'll also say this to close out. I saw where our buddy D. Orlando Ledbetter from the AJC's got his mock draft out for the first round. He's got the Falcons taking DeAndre Baker. A lot of Georgia fans who say the Falcons haven't drafted enough UGA guys, that would maybe certainly change that mood just a bit. We'll see you tomorrow here on DawgNation Daily. And on video. Good to have you with us. We'll get ready to go with our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. We're always hot and bothered during the show, and the R.S. Andrews Cool Down is a great way to get cooled down and relaxed and kind of get into the thick of the conversation, your thoughts about Georgia athletics and everything going on with the program. And, of course, speaking of R.S. Andrews, no matter what the weather is, the one that DawgNation trusts to fix anything that's going on with our houses is our friends with R.S. Andrews. They are the one call, we come, and it's fixed, folks. They arrive when they promise. They do only the work that's needed for a guaranteed upfront, no surprise price, whether it be heating, air, plumbing, electrical. They're the ones we trust to play every single position. So find them online at rsandrews.com. The website, once again, rsandrews.com. Great to have them as a part of the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. So I would imagine a lot of you want to talk about what you think Georgia's toughest game is for the upcoming season. We can do that, and we can be kind of free-for-all as well on any thoughts you may have about what's going on with the program right now. So we'll dive in on these comments on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, everything else in between. Emory David Davis says his family ran into a Swift and a Zeus bowling. How cool would that be to see, by the way? He says Zeus is huge. Yeah, I saw Georgia put that video out the other day of him doing some weight room stuff, and he certainly looked to be a pretty thick guy right now, which that's certainly going to help him this upcoming season. You've got to think. Philip Sharp on Facebook says that his ranking would be Texas A&M first, Notre Dame second, Florida third, Auburn fourth, Tennessee fifth. Yeah, for me, I can't put Notre Dame second because from a talent standpoint, I just don't think that Notre Dame is a great matchup for Georgia right now. I mean, I don't want to make too much out of what we saw against Clemson, but we saw Notre Dame didn't belong on that field. And I think a motivated Georgia is going to be looking in September to prove that Notre Dame doesn't belong on this field either. Connor Riley joins us.
I'd just like to point out, Notre Dame lost to Clemson by 27. Alabama lost by 28.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Now, granted, Notre Dame does lose a lot of the defensive talent. That was a big reason why they were in that game a year ago. They also lose their leading rusher in Dexter Williams. But I still think, just because Notre Dame didn't look good against Clemson, a lot of teams didn't look good against Clemson last year.
I think the one thing we've seen from Georgia under Kirby Smart is I think they liked buying into perceived slights. Now, they couldn't talk themselves into that against Texas because they didn't have, I guess, enough leadership to be able to do that. But I do think that Georgia likes feeding off that kind of stuff. They fed off that before Mississippi State in 2017. They fed off that even without Notre Dame saying anything before the game there. I think they kind of bought into people thinking that Notre Dame was some sort of historically good program and Georgia wasn't. They seem to feed off that. Georgia seems to be motivated by these kinds of things. I do expect Georgia to have an extra dose of motivation against Notre Dame in September.
But I still think, I'm just not that high on Tennessee. I get that they brought on a couple of blue chippers, specifically on the offensive tackles, but I'm not sure Jarrett Garantano is going to take that huge step forward. I don't know how much better that defense really gets. They added another highly rated 4-star linebacker, but they brought in J.J. Peterson a year ago, and he didn't exactly turn around that whole Tennessee defense. In Georgia, while it was rotating quarterbacks in that game, and admittedly it was an ugly game, they still scored 38 points on Tennessee.
So my thing about Tennessee is, once again, two things. As I said before, a theme of my ranking is going to be I really want to see Georgia prove it in these hostile road environments. I think that Neyland Stadium is going to be that this October. It didn't really work out that way in 2017. It was a 41-0 score. Georgia had an interception in the first play of the game and never looked back. But I do think Neyland's going to be hostile for Georgia this October. And I think that Jeremy Pruitt is not dangerous enough yet to build the kind of team that can compete week in and week out. But I do think there's that potential to rise up and play really well in one big game. The version of that for 2018 was probably at Auburn. That was probably the one game like that Tennessee played above its head to get the one win. It really needed to get to validate Pruitt. I don't think that they would be good enough to do that against Georgia this season, but I do think that's what Pruitt knows he needs to do next. If you can't have the dramatic year two turnaround the way that Kirby Smart did it for Georgia in 2017, then you've got to give your fans something, and that something might be playing really well against one of your major opponents. And that's where I think you got to be careful with Tennessee. They just really sell out to play really, really well on a Saturday in the hopes of proving something as far as what's being built there.
And my other concern with the tennis, not so much concern, but why maybe I'm not as worried about it as you are, is Georgia does have a bye week to prepare for that.
That's true.
Now, if they didn't have that bye week and they were going straight from hosting Notre Dame to going on the road against Tennessee, I would be worried about a letdown there. I mean, we certainly saw that being the case back in 2013 when, Georgia beats a top 10 LSU team at home. And the next week, yes, they had a lot of injuries in that game, but still, that team wasn't ready to dominate a not good Tennessee team from the jump.
Troy Batten on Facebook on a slightly different subject says Georgia's offensive line is eventually going to be all first and second round picks. And I think that's kind of my point when you start looking ahead to what this might become, because I think that Isaiah Wilson is going to get some draft attention for the 2020 draft. He may not go, but I think he's going to get some attention. I think that Andrew Thomas will be a well-received prospect. And you start thinking about some of those interior offensive linemen and how they could be viewed in the NFL. I think that once you become that pipeline of producing those draft picks, I think it just becomes easier to get them. I think you see the same version of that from Alabama on the defensive line. I don't like giving credit to Alabama, but you have to admit that I don't reckon there's been any program. I guess Ohio State's probably been close, but when it comes to putting defensive linemen in the NFL, over the last few years, they seem to be lapping the field multiple times in terms of producing those draft picks, which only means more defensive linemen want to go there. Antonio Alfano, think about how great of a prospect that was for the class of 2019. He seemed really convinced that Alabama was the place that could get him to the NFL. If Georgia builds that version of that on the offensive line, I just think it speaks to Kirby Smart being able to plant his flag for the next 5 to 10 years. So when you think about these SEC offensive tackles who could go in the first round of this year's draft, think about where Georgia could be in that discussion next year and how much that might help. Because in the case of Ole Miss, that pipeline is dried up. It was it's Greg Little this year, and he was the replacement for him. Why am I blanking on the guy's name who went to the Dolphins and lost his mind?
Laramie Tunsil.
Yeah, Laramie Tunsil. It was Tunsil before that. But listen, those big offensive linemen aren't coming through Oxford, Mississippi anymore for any time to come. Florida obviously wants to stay in that mix, and Alabama thinks it's going to be there for quite some time. But, for the most part, Georgia's the program that seems to be able to have the ability to recycle those guys right now, which could be a fun thing to see. Jarvis Hanna, interesting prediction on Facebook. I love these hot takes. He's got Alabama with 2. I'm assuming he means regular season losses next season. I think that's really interesting. Not to get too deep in the weeds, and I'll give Connor a chance to respond to this too, but when you see the Vegas over-unders coming out, I think it's really funny that for the most part, the Vegas over-unders are never quite as high as you think they might be. For a team like Alabama, I guess, last year was probably it's probably 11 or so, but for the most part, the Alabama over-under is never going to be much higher than about 10.5 because the odds of losing a regular season game are just higher than the general public thinks that it is. Alabama has a way of making it seem like a virtual impossibility, but when the Vegas over-under number comes out, it always reminds you that the chances of somebody suffering a loss are always greater than you might think, and once you've suffered a loss, the chance of suffering a second loss becomes a possibility too. So one of these days it's going to happen. Now, is it going to happen in 2019? They may still feel like they're in pretty good shape, but one of these days it's going to happen again.
So, yes, I do think the end is coming for Bama eventually. The time comes for us all.
Yeah.
But we've talked about Alabama's schedule before. Their non-conference slate, once again, is a joke, playing Duke, a big whoop. Their toughest game is probably at Texas A&M, which I do think will be a contest, but they get LSU at home, and they just own LSU. Like, they own real estate in their headspace. I just don't see LSU being up to beating Alabama on the road. Auburn, they do have to go visit Auburn, but I don't think I've said before I don't know how good this Auburn team is going to be in 2019. Schedule. I mean, unless you're willing to count the SEC championship game as a loss, I could certainly see that being the second loss for Alabama because I do have some concerns about them, especially on the defense. Because again, they lost 7 guys to the NFL draft this year. They have a ton of turnover, both in the secondary once again and in the offensive line. And as you kind of saw with Ohio State this year, when you keep losing guys at the same position over and over and over again, that was sort of the case with the Ohio State secondary. When you keep losing those guys early, eventually that catches up with you, and that certainly did this year with Ohio State in games against Purdue, and their defense took a step back, even though their offense was still transcendent.
Andrew Hughes on YouTube, to change the subject just slightly, says, what are the chances that UGA has the number 1 defense in the country at the end of the 2019 season, BA? That's a great question for our S. Andrews cool down here. Let me talk about this from the standpoint of why it might not happen. And when I think about why it might not happen, here are the 2 reasons that might hold Georgia back defensively. Is there enough run-stopping help to go along with Jordan Davis up front? That's one of those issues I think you have to deal with. Is there a cornerback that's going to step in and not play at a DeAndre Baker level? Baker was the Thorpe Award winner. But is there a cornerback that's going to step in and give Georgia something close to what it had last season with the ability to lock down and knock passes out of the air? Those are the 2 issues that I think that could potentially hold Georgia back. Now, it could be that Georgia is going to have a Tyson Campbell step in and play more in his second year, and it'll be a big improvement over year 1. That Eric Stokes continues to do what he did, and Devon Wilson becomes kind of that third cornerback, and all of a sudden Georgia with a slightly different looking secondary is just fine. And it could be that whether it be young guys stepping up, one of the Tramel Walthor playing some, or Zion Logue playing some, that it could be that Georgia can match the beef of Jordan Davis with some other guys, and it can have that tip of the spear that can stop the run, and maybe Georgia goes on to a truly elite defense. But if I think about the reasons why it might not happen, those are really the 2 things that come to my mind of the ability to really duplicate what Jordan Davis does for you as a big-time plug in the middle, and finding some way to kind of round out your cornerbacks in particular. I think the safeties, are going to be fine because of the total number of guys that are competing for spots. But can those cornerbacks find a way to competently replace what DeAndre Baker brought to the table?
There are 2 guys on this Georgia team, as I say this on February 25th, that if they go down to injury for a significant amount of time, Georgia's going to have a very tough time reaching its goal, and I think its goal is to win a national championship this year. And that is Jake Fromm, and that is Jordan Davis as of right now. Those 2 guys cannot get hurt.
Yeah.
We saw specifically with just with regards to Fromm quickly, they don't have a backup quarterback right now. You'd be excited for Stetson Bennett, Dwan Mathis, but if those guys have to play more than a game or more than finish a game, you're not feeling too great about Georgia's chances.
Yeah.
as far as Davis, he didn't really play much in the LSU game when Georgia just got absolutely roasted rushing the ball, gave up 275 rushing yards to an okay LSU rushing attack. And then he didn't play in the bowl game against Texas, and Georgia really struggled to stop the run, both from a running back and a quarterback run standpoint. And it's certainly concerning that one guy is sort of that important to your defense and what you want to do. Because Georgia, first and foremost, they want to stop the run. They want to, put you in those 2nd and 8, 2nd and 7, 3rd and 6 type scenarios. And when Davis wasn't in there, teams were able to turn those 2nd and longs and 3rd and longs into 2nd and short and 3rd and short. And I think that's a big reason why Georgia lost those games to LSU and Texas. And until we sort of know if there's a possible guy who could fill in and provide a role similar to Davis, I think he's incredibly valuable to this team.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. So Johnny Lester and others were talking about Justin Fields in the YouTube comment section. At the risk of kind of bringing up a touchy subject, I do want to address this just for a second. So DeAndre Walker, the former Georgia outside linebacker, obviously terrific former Georgia player, goes on a radio station in Atlanta on 92.9 The Game, and he talked about a number of subjects and seemed to be pretty candid with what he said. He was asked about Fromm and Fields, and DeAndre Walker says about there being any kind of locker room divide. He says, no, never. If anything, it was the coaches that had the hardest decision to make. Each guy came in every day and worked hard. They were trying to do better, the team, and better themselves. That's all that really mattered. They both were amazing guys and players as well. The fact that DeAndre Walker in that conversation, you can read the transcript at DawgNation.com, but the fact that Walker in that transcript seemed pretty open to saying what was on his mind, the fact that he says there was no locker room divide when it comes to Fromm and Fields. Connor, do you put any value into DeAndre Walker's statement there at all?
Yeah, because, why would he lie?
That's my point. At this stage,
yeah,
why not just say the truth? Now,
exactly.
It's sort of like now it can be told.
Right.
I mean, he seems very willing, and like I said, you all should go to DawgNation.com and check out the rest of the transcript to see all of this, but he seems very willing to speak the truth on a number of subjects. So if he says there was no locker room divide, I guess I'm inclined to believe him.
Yeah, and, this is maybe where some people I know certain media members and fans don't really much care for this, saying, hey, we should have better access, hear more from players, get more honesty from them, the coaches, etc. I think that issue of, the theoretical locker room divide, which was certainly, there was, something looming there over the season, in the absence of not having players really talk about it, there are certain narratives and places that pump up that sort of narrative. And if you have guys like DeAndre Walker, Jonathan Ledbetter, Terry Godwin, DeAndre Swift come out and say, no, there's no locker room divide. We're just trying to do what's best. I do think that doesn't become the issue that it became for Georgia in the course of the 2018 season.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Let me go to Facebook, get a few comments over the Facebook comment section. Al Birchfield says Walker is straight up, I wish him well. Yeah, I think one of the untold stories, and Connor, I know you've talked about this a lot, but one of the untold stories for Georgia in that SEC championship game is what happened when DeAndre Walker left that game. And, the Alabama part of this gets a lot more attention, the switch over from Tua Tagovailoa to Jalen Hurts, that gets a lot more of the attention. But when Tagovailoa goes down, DeAndre Walker goes down too. He was just such a good player at Georgia. He'll go down probably as a really underrated player because in 2017 he was thought to be a situational pass rusher. In 2018, he didn't have maybe as big and bold a personality as some of the other guys we've seen come through Georgia, so he probably doesn't get mentioned alongside the Lorenzo Carters and people like that. Even really, from a personality standpoint, he kind of seems even smaller in stature than a guy like Davin Bellamy. But to watch him play against the best in college football and see him really be dominant, that SEC championship could have really gone differently had DeAndre Walker not gotten hurt.
I think he's going to be a very, very good, very, very productive NFL player.
As an every down type of player?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
That's what he did. He was an every down player this year for Georgia, led the team with 7.5 sacks. And, if he was playing in a more aggressive defensive system, I think he would have had even more. I think a lot of times Kirby sort of preached, hey, our secondary is good enough to where just keep the quarterback contained. Because, the biggest concern for Georgia last year, I think, was their linebacker play. And when, quarterbacks got loose, and you saw that in the SEC championship game, when quarterbacks got outside the pocket, Georgia's linebackers just weren't good enough to really be able to contain those athletic, mobile quarterbacks, and I think Walker actually did a very good job of sort of keeping those guys in the pocket, and you certainly saw that be the case against Alabama when he was in there against Tua. And I said before, and I'll say it again, if DeAndre Walker is able to finish that game, Georgia's playing for a national championship. I don't know if they beat Clemson, but they're certainly in that game.
As a part of our R.S. Andrews cooldown, Matt Rukavina says, is Notre Dame an early playoff game? Auburn will only determine whether we send them to the Belk Bowl or the Independence Bowl. I don't believe that the Notre Dame game is a playoff game for Georgia, because if Georgia wins the SEC, it's still going to make the college football playoff. Now, if you're trying to be that second SEC team again, honestly, we'll go round and round about that. I think in most years the SEC is just – the committee is just not going to want to put two SEC teams in. And I think it's going to be a lot easier for them to give Alabama that benefit of the doubt than it is to Georgia, because Alabama's won multiple national championships. But what I really believe the Notre Dame game is about, and I talked about this a little bit on Friday, I think that Georgia, not that you ever have a reason to lose a game, but I think that Georgia ought to be really, really motivated to try to win them all this year. Because given the fact that Peach Bowl is in Atlanta, it's a college football playoff semifinal game this year, Clemson wants to be there, Alabama wants to be there, both those teams could be in the playoff. I just think playing that Peach Bowl game in Atlanta is a huge, huge advantage. It's more of an advantage probably for Georgia and Clemson than it is Alabama, but it's still a big advantage for all three. And then go to New Orleans for the game, for the national championship game. I think that given the choice of having to go to Arizona for the Fiesta Bowl, come back to Georgia, then go to New Orleans, or stay in Georgia the entire time and only have to travel to go to New Orleans for the national championship, that to me would make winning a national championship a lot easier. But you got to be undefeated to be in that game. I don't think you can be 14-1 and or 13-1 and be picked to play in Atlanta. I think you got to be undefeated to be there, unless you're the number 4 seed. But then there's no guarantee you make the playoff.
I think there's a pretty good chance that even if Georgia does go undefeated next year, there's a good chance they're still going to Phoenix to play.
Why would you say that?
Because Clemson is going to be the unquestioned number 1 team in the season, and if they go undefeated and play like they did this year, even if the ACC is garbage, Clemson is going to have that built-in benefit of the doubt from the year before. That I think, regardless of even though Georgia will have played a better schedule, because Clemson will have that game against A&M, they will have that game against South Carolina. I wonder if even Georgia going undefeated is going to be enough to leapfrog an unbeaten Clemson team.
Let me tell you something right now. If Georgia undefeated beats Alabama in the SEC championship and can't leapfrog to the number 1 seed at that point in time, y'all better buckle up, because we're going to have war paint on that. I get what you're saying. If you're the wire-to-wire number 1 defending national champion and you start the season off as the preseason number 1, you stay undefeated the entire time, the polls don't change. But the committee is supposed to be a little more flexible or introspective, or whatever the right word is. They're supposed to be examining this stuff a little closer. I'm not trying to be like, Joe SEC here, but what could Clemson do from an ACC standpoint that could validate a number 1 seed over Georgia if Georgia goes undefeated playing the schedule it's going to play?
Well, they have 2 games against SEC foes in A&M, South Carolina,
right.
And if they whip up on both of those, I think they should going into next year. I know you're very high on A&M. I'd still kind of like to see it from them. If they go and they win those 2 games comfortably and they run through the ACC like they should, I find it being a hard. I think there's a very good chance people are just going to go ahead and push Clemson in. For example, on Friday, the Paul Feinbaum show tweeted a graphic. Is the Pac-12 closer to the American and a Group of 5 conference and a Power 5 conference? And it was like, the conference averaged 6.8 wins, 2 teams that finished the season ranked, 2 teams that finished in the top 25. The ACC averaged 7. The average ACC team finished with 7.1 wins last year. There were 2 teams that won 10 games, Clemson and Syracuse, and those were the only 2 teams that were ranked in the top 25 to end the season. So there isn't a huge difference between the ACC and the Pac-12, and Clemson yet still gets that huge benefit of the doubt, and this idea that and rightfully so. But if Clemson goes undefeated, I I can see the committee very easily just saying we're going to put Clemson at number 1.
And Memphis Dog says Clemson could easily go undefeated.
Yeah.
And I think that they could too. And I've got no beef with Clemson. Clemson's obviously an elite team. I've got no beef with Clemson whatsoever. But my beef would be that if conference championships aren't going to matter, you got to stop pretending like you got to stop having them, because Clemson's going to be playing like the number 17 team in the country in Charlotte.
At best.
Yeah.
They played a 7-5 Pitt team this year.
Georgia's likely to be playing what could be another undefeated team in the SEC championship. If it wins that game, I think Georgia's got to be the number 1 seed. And in most years, this doesn't matter, because in a lot of years, it's, are you going to New Orleans or are you going to Miami? Well, for Georgia, there's not a huge degree of difference about that. But that Atlanta, especially for Clemson and especially for Georgia, that Atlanta would matter so much, because for Clemson, it's only about 90 minutes away. For Georgia, it's about the same distance. It would be such a geographic advantage. You know, Clemson doesn't have quite as big a fan base as Georgia does, but in terms of just the overall travel, it's just such a huge advantage. And ironically, about the only way that Georgia could get there would be to be the number 1 seed, because let's say that Georgia worked out as the number 4 seed. Clemson does not want to play Georgia in Atlanta in the Peach Bowl. You know what I'm saying? So at that point in time, if it has to be number 1 seed Clemson playing number 4 seed Georgia, at that point in time, Clemson would probably rather play the game in Arizona than play the game in Atlanta.
Right. Well, ESPN's not ESPN, college football reporter Brett McMurphy, we took a look at his college football playoff rankings last week. He had Clemson and Alabama playing in the Peach Bowl.
Yeah, that's because he had Georgia as the 3 seed, right?
Number 2 seed, I believe.
I think in Oklahoma 2, Georgia 3. But either way,
Oklahoma won't be the number 2 team to end the season.
Right. Yeah. But if it worked out where Georgia was the number 4 seed at that point in time, I think whether it's Alabama or Clemson, they're probably saying, let's move this game to Arizona. We don't want to play Georgia in Atlanta. So, look, there's a lot that's going to happen between now and then, but it is worth paying attention to. When the Peach Bowl is a semifinal game, it's going to be a very attractive destination for who goes there. R.S. Andrews, cool down. Let's get a couple more comments before we get ready to go.
Conversely, when the semifinals are in the Rose Bowl, I want everything in its power to happen where Georgia plays in the Rose Bowl.
Yeah,
I think every college football fan should want that.
Honestly, it was just one of the great experiences. And, I mean, it's such an attractive destination that as far as having your fans there and things like that, you've got nothing to worry about. I will say, though, I wasn't in there to see this, but this is one of those now it can be told things of Kirby Smart, 4 seconds after winning the Rose Bowl, came in that locker room on a tirade about getting the media out of there so they could get on a plane and get back home. So as cool and as much fun as the Rose Bowl is, and I don't care if Georgia wins 15 national championships, that game against Oklahoma will probably end up being the thing about my sporting life that I remember more than anything else. Kirby Smart was all business when that was done, because he did realize on a short week, and this was a weird deal because
this year there's almost 2 full weeks between. There's more than 2 full weeks between the semifinal game and the championship game.
Because the 2017 national championship game fell on a Monday and New Year's Day also fell on a Monday, that was the shortest amount of time there can be between the 2 games. It's just a full week. I think Kirby was really nervous about having to fly from California back to Georgia to get ready for a game less than a week or exactly a week away. So as much fun as that was all for us, when the game was over, Kirby, who's always got his game face on, was very mindful of the travel. That just worth bringing up, I guess. Chevron Hannah on our YouTube comment section, what happened between the rivalry in Georgia and Clemson? This is one of those things that got lost to scheduling once the SEC first went to a 12-game schedule in the early 90s. That kind of, for the most part, brought the end of the Georgia-Clemson rivalry. But back in the 80s, I've said this before, back then Georgia only played a 6-game conference schedule, so a lot of what Georgia did was outside the conference. Back then that included South Carolina and Clemson. Georgia-Clemson was a huge game back in the 80s, a big rivalry. And I'd love to see that thing being played more regularly, for sure. I'd love to see that. Not in
2029.
Yeah. As we joked about before, as it stands right now, Georgia's scheduled to play Texas, Clemson, and Georgia Tech all in 2029. Something tells me that's not going to quite happen. I wouldn't mind seeing them play every year, but something about the current landscape suggests that might not exactly go down that way. Let's see what else we got here. Kelly Burnett says, honestly, if this Georgia team wins the national championship with our schedule, it'll probably be the greatest UGA team of all time. It's going to be rough. Yeah, I mean, listen, this is a challenging Georgia schedule. There'll be probably 5 or so teams on the Georgia schedule ranked in the preseason top 25, and I think that's it's a legitimate test. You shouldn't hear a lot of Heather Dinnich's complaining about who Georgia's playing this year. You shouldn't see a lot of that heading into this season really at all. Let me go to Facebook here for a moment. Matt Rugavina says, I wouldn't mind a rematch with Texas. I think it's going to be really interesting to see if Texas can live up to the Texas is back hype that comes the way of the Longhorns, given the fact they won the Sugar Bowl. I've seen some evidence to suggest that, for Texas, it's going to be a little hard to match that in 2019. I'm not quite ready to go on the record about this as of yet, but I do think there's going to be a lot expected of Texas now. It's going to be interesting to see if they can back a lot of that up. Bill Wilkins says the next big commit prediction. That's an interesting one to think about. I guess I'm starting to look ahead to the month of March and Robbie Ashford's potential decision and what that means for Georgia as you start thinking about that quarterback for the class of 2020. Some people really like Ashford. Some people are crossing their fingers and hoping for the nation's number one quarterback, DJ Uiagalelei. So you'll start to see some of those quarterback bricks falling into place here pretty soon.
I would say Ashford is probably the big name to watch, just given with what Jeff Sintel has reported about some of the big targets. Arik Gilbert sounds like a August late summer decision. Brian Brzee is almost definitely going to be a December decision. I believe Miles Murphy's in that same late August or late July, early August window, sort of before the high school football season kicks off. Sort of knowing that those are Georgia's top targets, Ashford is probably the name guy to watch there.
Mike Bennett on our Facebook comment section as a part of our R.S. Andrews cooldown said, BA, what would you think about the Rose Bowl being the site for the national championship every year? I have mixed feelings on this. First of all, when you are there, there's no denying that it feels like the place where the national championship should be played. It's hard to imagine there being a bigger feeling college football game than the one in Pasadena, just because the committee, and I know this kind of stuff, seems waxing poetic, but it really is true. The Tournament of Roses committee does such a good job of hosting that bowl and making everybody feel so welcome, and they're so kind and friendly. They really roll out the red carpet, and the big city of Los Angeles is a backdrop for that. Just goes into the feeling of how big the whole thing feels, and for those of us who grew up in the South, unique and different because that's not a game we grew up watching our favorite team play. So the whole thing just feels over the top and spectacular. However, the counterpoint to that is, I do think there's something kind of cool to be said for if Georgia goes on a big run over the course of years. I think it's kind of cool to think that Georgia could do that going to a lot of different destinations. I won't pretend that Glendale, Arizona is anywhere near as cool as Pasadena, California, but it's kind of cool to think that you could travel the world, so to speak, or at least the country, following Georgia football over the course of the next few years, and that these different venues could become special in their own right for a different reason. So I'm of mixed emotions on that. I kind of like the idea of the Georgia fan kind of getting to go on a tour of the country over the course of the next few years as a part of what you hope is a long run for Georgia. Listen, if you're going to go by merit and prestige, there's no denying that Pasadena deserves it every single year. But there's also something to be said for, like the old school, suitcases that had the travel stickers on them. It's kind of cool to think that over the course of time, you had a lot of those stickers to your own suitcase as far as seeing Georgia and Miami in the future year, or Arizona in the future year, Dallas almost certainly at some point in time. I don't know that they're going back to the Bay Area again, but that's another one of those destinations that
not
can
really
be
the Bay Area.
Yeah, that can be collected. Well, it's still the Bay Area. That's one of those destinations that can be collected. So I'm kind of two different minds on that.
I forget who made the original point that the national title game should be in Pasadena at the Rose Bowl every year, but I just want to thank them because that is the correct opinion. That game should just be played. It's college football's best stadium, best venue, the most iconic game in college football every year, the Rose Bowl anyway. Non-championship game, of course. And I just think that should be like the statement game for college football. It's arguably the best stadium, I think, in the country, regardless of sport.
Yeah, it's not a nice stadium, but it's a cool stadium.
Yeah,
it's a very, very cool stadium because
I think that's the correct opinion. The national title game, much like the Masters are at Augusta every year.
Yeah,
I think we should treat the national championship like the Rose Bowl.
It's funny you would say that because when I was in Pasadena, and like Pasadena itself is just a different feeling town than probably anywhere else you've ever been. It's just a really unique topography. But being there in Pasadena, it gave me that feeling of being in Augusta, of this very memorable looking ground. You know, the outdoors there is just really, really distinct and memorable looking. And that's what Pasadena kind of feels like as well. By the way, let me read a comment from Miriam Martin Corbin here about Georgia's tough schedule. She says, I agree about that, but she says the team, hungry, loaded with talent, new coaching energy. I think we're going to kick some backside all over the place. That's Miriam Martin Corbin, really excited about that. We love to hear from Miriam. And I do think that two things in particular that she brings up, I'm curious to see. She talks about the team being hungry. That's obviously seemingly the message behind the do more, big team, little me t-shirts. I hope they show that. I hope they really demonstrate just how hungry they are coming off of not quite enough at the end of the 2018 season. I hope it's them that demonstrate just how hungry they are for more this season. And she talks about new coaching energy. I think that James Coley brings a lot of that as the offensive coordinator. I think that Dan Lanning and Glenn Schumann, Lanning in the DC role, Schumann kind of his chief lieutenant, the addition of Charlton Warren, I think they bring a lot as well. I know some people are going to say, ooh, this is a young Georgia coaching staff, but it is also an energetic coaching staff, to use Miriam's phrase there. I think that could be a really interesting thing to see. All right, we got time for just a little bit more, and then we're going to get out of here. Thanks for being a part of the show here today, and I'm still not probably 100% with the voice, but I feel like I sounded a good bit better today, so hopefully you kind of feel that way as well. Let's see what we got here. Frank Crowder says, just keep rubbing the Rose Bowl experience of the ones who weren't there into our faces, BA. That's not my intention, Frank. You know that. Hopefully one day a lot of Georgia fans will get a chance to make that trip and be a part of that. But it admittedly is a bucket list experience for sure. LeBrian Hudson says, why didn't we play Notre Dame in the 2018 season? In some cases, that's just the way that schedules work out, and I'm assuming from a Notre Dame standpoint, because their schedule's a lot more flexible than Georgia's because they don't play a traditional conference schedule, at least a full conference schedule. It was probably something more on their end that 2019 was the first time that could be done, but the return trip's coming this year, and it should be a lot of fun. A lot of fun. Howard Rozier says, do you think they open the playbook up this year? As I said before, I think that you need, if you want to distill this down in its simplest term, you got to find about 4 more passing attempts per game. And of those 4 more passing attempts, you need 2 of those to be completions of 20 or more yards down the field. You can do that. Simple, right? 4 more attempts, 2 more big completions, and I think you've changed the entire tone of this Georgia offense. K9 Blues asks a good question. When's the next meetup going to be for DawgNation? So at the very least, we'll do some stuff to get ready for G-Day coming up. We'll tell you about that. We've also got some big plans coming up for the summer as well, K9. So stick close to us, and we'll be able to tell you some about that kind of stuff. Ninja the Noob says, BA on the phone with Jeff or Before the Hedges was the best he ever sounded. Yeah, that was one of those things where I'd been kind of laid up all day that day. And when but the first time I talked all day long was when I, talked to Jeff on the phone. And boy, when I started trying to make some words come out, I was like, woo, this voice is not really working too well right now. For sure. Chad Clark says, every time we play Notre Dame, it's like a home game. It certainly was that in 2017. When you think about those hostile road environments, Notre Dame doesn't count because of how many Georgia fans that were there. It wasn't hostile that day at all. It's hard to imagine, hard to believe, but that's really the way that worked out. Just not a hostile road trip for Georgia that day. It'll be interesting to see how many Notre Dame fans find their way into Athens. I know there are a lot of people, who live in the Atlanta area, probably grow up cheering for Notre Dame. This may be one of the rare times they get a chance to see that team play in person. They may try to get into the stadium, but Georgia fans are not going to be as willing to part with their tickets as those Notre Dame fans were 2 years ago. So that could be interesting to see. Memphis Dog says, BA, give us your best Tarzan yell. I don't think my best Tarzan yell would be quite as good as you might think it should be. I don't think that would probably work out too well. Eric Smith says, what's our point average going to be this year? That's an interesting question. What was it last year? Probably about 38 or so per game.
38.7.
I don't see any reason why they should be able to crack the 40 number this year.
The unofficial over-under I am setting is 39.7.
Okay. Let me look at the 2019 schedule real quick. Like, what are the games where Georgia's going to be most likely to be held below 40?
Off the top of my head, I would probably say the Notre Dame game doesn't strike me as a game Georgia may get to 40.
Really? You don't think they score 40 against Notre Dame?
Clemson didn't.
They didn't have to.
They didn't.
I would say the Auburn game is a tough game to score 40. 40 on the road in Jordan-Hare Stadium. That's not gonna be an easy
That's
thing.
probably a good one. Can't rule out Tennessee, though, because they did that to Tennessee the last time they were there. And Jake Fromm was not good in that game either. So imagine how they would play if he did play pretty well down the road at Tennessee.
I think Mike Elko's Aggies would be tough to score 40 on.
Yeah, especially with the way A&M plays. They don't, and Jimbo Fisher, they don't run a high speed or up-tempo offense. That's going to be a grinded out, 26 or 28-24 type of game.
Last time South Carolina came to Athens, they pitched a pretty good defensive game plan against Georgia. Didn't do that this past time in Columbia. You think South Carolina sells out? That's one of those interesting games where Gamecocks typically sell out to stop the run. That's one of those you could really learn a lot about Jake Fromm there that day.
Yep.
October 12th in Athens. How about this one? Week 1 in Nashville on the road. Does Georgia score 40 points against Vanderbilt?
I think Georgia scores 50.
That'd be a nice showing on the road. I
think they have. I think that first game is going to be really important for Georgia just because it is kind of a marquee stage. They're playing a conference opponent on the road, and they're playing soy-free cupcakes the next couple of weeks before Notre Dame. So I think that's going to be a game where they really get a chance to make a semi-big statement.
Let's finish up with this as a part of our R.S. Andrews cool down. K9 Blue says, B.A., what do you see as the biggest difference between the Coley offense and the Chaney offense this season? So this may not be the answer that everybody's looking for, but this is my belief that ultimately the stuff that you're going to see James Coley do this year, I think there's a chance you would have seen Jim Chaney do those things last year, or I should say this year as well, where he's still the Georgia offensive coordinator. I'm not as anti-Chaney as some other people are. I am pro-Coley, but more along the lines of I just believe the Georgia offense is set up well to succeed. So I think some of the things that Coley's going to have as disposal this year that maybe Chaney didn't have, I do think he's going to have a more dynamic collection of wide receivers, even if they're not quite as proven as guys like Riley Ridley and McCole Hardman would have been if they chose to stick around for a while. I think this is a pretty dynamic collection of wide receivers. I think it's a junior quarterback as opposed to a freshman or a sophomore quarterback was what Jake Fromm was in 2017, 2018. I think that makes a big difference. And I think that ultimately James Coley is going to be treated as a major upgrade over Jim Chaney when really I think he's going to just be benefiting from some pieces that Georgia has that maybe Georgia would not have had under Jim Chaney the last couple of years. I think that Chaney's probably going to do fine for Tennessee. Not enough to make them a real threat in the SEC East, but I'm not really looking to kick Chaney on the way out the door. There are a couple of things that I wish he would have done differently at Georgia, but I am not of the belief that every single thing that was imperfect about the Georgia offense the last couple of seasons is all Jim Chaney's fault. I'm not of that. But what Alabama's doing to Tosh LaPoy, Georgia fans should avoid doing to Jim Chaney. You're going to hear every Alabama fan say the entire reason why Alabama didn't win the national championship, it's all going to be sort of summed up and kind of tidied up and sort of laid at the feet of Tosh LaPoy. It was all this rookie coach's fault. And now that he's gone, everything's going to be better. A lot of Georgia fans are going to be tempted to do the same thing with Jim Chaney and say, oh, because this stale, old, boring, tired offensive coordinator's gone, now everything for Georgia is going to be a lot better. I think in both cases, the Alabama case with LaPoy, the Georgia case with Chaney, I think both of those are just too tidy of explanations.
I'm gonna touch a third rail here. I understand why you want to say don't kick Chaney on the way out the door, and I don't think Georgia fans have done that to an extent. But Jeff Sintel and I were talking last week when he came in, and Jeff had said that he recently rewatched the whole Georgia Alabama game beginning to end, and I've sort of had the same thought with as well as Jake Fromm was playing in that game. I don't get how or why you try and insert Justin Fields into that game, and I just wonder what kind of hand Chaney had in the process of that, because it was very clear that Fromm was an incredible quarterback that day and clearly good enough to win Georgia that game. And I just wonder who was sort of making and pushing that decision to get Fields in there and try and interrupt Fromm's rhythm.
So I'm tempted to blame Kirby for that. If you're going to blame somebody,
yeah,
I'm tempted to blame Kirby.
That could certainly be the case. I don't know who had a hand in that. And I think that if Georgia fans ever want to relitigate that game, I do think the usage of just not doing what they did in the Florida game with Fromm and say, hey, it's your ship. You're either going to lead us to where we want to go, or you're going to sink us. And I just, that's something that if you ever want to relitigate it, you certainly can do so.
Always fun to talk Georgia football here as part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. We do it at the end of DawgNation Daily every single day. We appreciate your participation. We'll do it again tomorrow as well. Regular show starts at 10 a.m. The R.S. Andrews Cool Down right after that. And, of course, if you're wondering about R.S. Andrews, here's all you need to know. Heating, air, plumbing, electrical, whatever you need at your house, R.S. Andrews, the one we kind of trust to touch them all the different positions. R.S. Andrews plays them well. They show up on time. They're trained. They're well versed in what needs to be done. They don't overcharge you. They don't underdeliver. They do exactly what you need at the price they promise. They do all of that for you. That's why we love our friends at R.S. Andrews. You can find them online at rsandrews.com. rsandrews.com. Spring weather's coming. Your house is going to need to crank up that air conditioning again soon. Don't be surprised when you need it that it doesn't work. Start getting it checked right now with our friends at R.S. Andrews, and you will be glad you did. So we call it the R.S. Andrews Cool Down because a lot of houses are going to be cooling down really soon, and you want to make sure yours is cooling down the way that it's supposed to. Thanks for being with us for our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. We'll look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for DawgNation Daily Live once again.